You know, when we think of the Crusades, it's easy to picture this simple, clash of civilizations. A unified Christian West versus a unified Islamic East. But the truth? The reality on the ground was, wow, it was so much more complex, way more chaotic, and honestly, a lot more fascinating. And today we're going to dive right into the story of one city that was smack in the middle of this incredible storm, Damascus. So let's get right into it. The thing you've got to understand is, before a single crusader ever even showed up, the Great Seljuk Empire, this massive Turkic state that basically ran the Middle East, had already completely fallen apart. It shattered. So the whole region was just this landscape of ambitious warlords and rival cities all fighting each other for power. The Crusaders didn't walk into some peaceful, unified land. No way. They walked straight into the middle of a civil war. And that brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did one city, Damascus, manage to pull it off? I mean, think about it. They were surrounded by enemies on all sides. You had the Frankish invaders, you had rival Muslim lords, and you had threats from the inside. So how did they not just survive, but actually thrive as an independent power for over 50 years? Okay, to really get what Damascus was up against, you have to understand the world it was living in. And let me tell you, it was a seriously complicated political chessboard. This timeline here, it's basically a recipe for a perfect storm. So first, you've got the old Seljuk Empire just collapsing, leaving this massive power vacuum. Then, right in the middle of all that chaos, a local Turkoman leader named Tuktakin swoops in and takes control of Damascus, starting his own dynasty, the Burids. And then, as if that wasn't enough, a totally new player enters the game, the First Crusade. They capture Jerusalem and set up these permanent Christian kingdoms right on the coast. All of a sudden, the entire political chessboard is just flipped upside down. Total chaos. So in this totally fractured world, how did Damascus even begin to play the game? Well, they chose a path that was, let's just say, radically pragmatic. Yeah, their whole philosophy was brutally simple. Just do whatever it takes to survive. That's it. This wasn't about some grand religious crusade or building a huge empire. Nope. It was all about one thing, protecting their city's independence and its prosperity. And they'd do anything to make that happen. And this just captures their insane, dizzying strategy perfectly. The rulers of Damascus, they made alliances with literally everyone. Seriously, look at this. One year, they'd team up with the Crusader Franks to go after a rival Muslim lord. The very next year, they'd join forces with the Fatimids from Egypt to fight those exact same Franks. For Damascus, there were no such things as permanent friends or permanent enemies. There were only permanent interests. It was this constant, complicated diplomatic dance, and somehow, for 50 years, it actually worked. It kept them alive. But here's the thing. The threats to Damascus weren't just about armies marching on their gates. Oh no, there was a much more sinister danger growing, right there in the shadows of the Muslim world itself. These guys were known as the Bathiniya. They were this really secretive sect that had broken away from the main Ismaili branch of Shia Islam down in Egypt. Now, you've probably heard of them by another name, the one the Crusaders gave them, the one that's stuck in history, the Assassins. And their method was, well, it was terrifyingly effective. They used targeted political murder to take out their enemies and spread their influence through pure fear. And this quote really gets to the heart of the problem. See, a Crusader army, you could see that coming from miles away. You knew who they were, you knew what they wanted. But the Batinia, they were a hidden enemy, an invisible threat. They could be anyone, a guard in your palace or merchant in the market. For the rulers of Damascus, this was a constant, totally unpredictable threat, coming from inside their own city. So in May of 1131, that shadow war just explodes into the open. Bataniya agents attack the ruler of Damascus, a guy named Bori, right in broad daylight. He actually survives the initial attack, and the city just erupts. There's this massive, violent massacre of anyone even suspected of being a member of the sect. But here's the thing. The assassins had already achieved their goal. A year later, Bori died from his wounds. He became a victim of an enemy he never saw coming. So while Damascus is busy fighting for its life on all these different fronts, a new power is rising up in the north. And this guy, he was about to change the rules of the game completely. His name was Zangi. Now Zangi, who ruled Mosul and Aleppo, he had this idea that was pretty revolutionary for the time. He looked at all the constant infighting and said, no more. He started pushing this concept of a united Islamic front. His goal was simple: unify all of Syria under one ruler, him, of course, and then drive the Franks back into the sea. And this whole ideology, it was a direct, existential threat to the way Damascus did business, with all its independent alliance-juggling strategies. And when Zengi eventually died, that ambition didn't die with him. It passed to his son, Nur al-Din, who was maybe even more capable. For Damascus, Nur al-Din was the ultimate threat. He had the exact same goal as his dad, unification. And Damascus, well, Damascus was the final, biggest, most important piece of that puzzle. But before that final showdown could happen, one of the weirdest events in the entire history of the Crusades took place. The Second Crusade shows up. It's this massive army from Europe, and they have one single goal: take Damascus. And they start off pretty well. They attack from the west through the city's lush orchards, which gave them plenty of food and cover. But then things just get bizarre. The local Crusader lords, and nobody knows for sure why, maybe they were bribed, maybe they were just jealous, they convinced the European kings to move the entire army. Where to? To the eastern side of the city. Now, this side was a barren, waterless plain right in front of the strongest walls. So what happens? Unsurprisingly, with no water and getting hammered by defenders, this huge, mighty crusade just collapses in 4 days. It was a stunning victory for Damascus, almost comical, really. But it would be their last. So, after all those decades of skillfully playing its enemies against each other, the end for an independent Damascus didn't come with a bang. It came with a whisper. See, the very strategy that had kept the city safe for so long, it also completely exhausted it. All that constant warfare, the endless shifting alliances, the power struggles inside the walls, it had all taken its toll. The city was just tired. Its leadership was a mess. The end came fast. In 1149, the city's brilliant regent, Anar, the guy who was the architect of their whole diplomatic strategy, he dies. This creates a huge power vacuum, and for years there's just infighting. And Nur al-Din, he sees his chance. But he doesn't attack with an army. He's smarter than that. Instead, he just imposes a devastating trade blockade. Food prices skyrocket. People start to starve. And finally, a group inside the city decides that being united under Nur al-Din is better than starvation and chaos, and they just open the gates. And just like that, in 1154, without a single big battle being fought, the 59-year-old dynasty of Damascus came to a quiet end. The city was just absorbed into Nur al-Din's growing Syrian empire. And so the fall of Damascus just completely resets the entire chessboard. For the very first time, you have a largely united Syria driven by this powerful idea of a holy war, and it's facing off against the divided, constantly squabbling Crusader states. That chaotic free-for-all that had defined the region for half a century, it was over. A new, much more focused, and frankly, much more dangerous conflict was about to kick off. Which leaves us with one big question. In this new game, who really had the advantage?